Part 1. Background to the protests. It all started when the U.S. government announced a long-discussed decision: drastic cuts in health, social security, and education spending. These cuts would hit the most vulnerable sectors of society, especially low-income families, the elderly, and students. It meant reduced services in hospitals, shrinking social welfare programs, and reduced funding for schools, which would have a profound impact on the lives of millions of people. It was at this point that public anger was ignited and the hands-off movement was born. This movement first started with a hashtag on social media platforms. The #hands-off campaign quickly went viral, bringing together the anxieties and frustrations people feel in their daily lives. From Washington, D.C. to California, from New York to Texas, thousands of people decided to take to the streets and make their voices heard. Banners proclaiming, "Hands off our rights," slogans blaring from megaphones, and the energy of the crowds turned major cities into protest scenes. Part 2. The growth of the protests and media coverage. The impact of the protests went beyond the borders of the United States and had a global resonance. From Europe to Asia, news channels and newspapers around the world covered the hands-off movement. Major media outlets, such as BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera, broadcast live coverage of the crowds on the streets and their demands. On social media, the movement created a tsunami of millions of shares and comments. Celebrities, activists, and even some politicians have openly expressed their support for the movement. So how did the government react to this growing wave? Initial statements from the White House carried a cautious tone. Government officials argued that the cuts were necessary to restore economic balance and hinted that these decisions could be reviewed. But these words were far from enough for the protesters. The crowds on the streets demanded concrete steps and a complete reversal of the cuts. The government's ambiguous stance led to further growth of the movement and increased determination. In some cities, protests continued late into the night, with people making it clear that they would not give up until their demands were met. Part 3. The future of the protests and their impact. All eyes are now on the future of the protests. Organizers are planning more large-scale demonstrations in the coming weeks. There is talk of a big march in the capital, Washington, D.C., which is expected to bring tens of thousands of people together. Could the hands-off movement become more than just a reaction, but a symbol of the long-accumulated social and economic disenfranchisement in the U.S.? Some see this as the beginning of a new era of social resistance. Opinion polls confirm that the movement has broad support. According to the latest polls, more than 60% of the public oppose the government's plans for cuts and consider the protesters' demands justified. Economists, however, see the debate in a different light. They warn that the cuts may close the budget deficit in the short term, but in the long term could lead to bigger problems with the collapse of social services. What do you think about this movement? Will the protests force the government to back down, or will it just be a temporary outburst of anger? How do you see the government's stance affecting the upcoming elections? Share your views with us in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss such current events and analysis. Your voice is heard here.